The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned village of Khost, Afghanistan, creating a patchwork of light and darkness that could hide 100 threats. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez crouched behind a crumbling stone wall that had probably stood for centuries before American boots ever touched this soil. Her M4 carbine felt warm in her hands from the rising heat, its familiar weight both comforting and insufficient for what her instincts were telling her was coming. The silence felt wrong in ways that went beyond normal caution. After 3 tours in this unforgiving country, Maria had learned to read the landscape like a survival manual written in dust and stone. The wind patterns, the way birds moved through the sky, the subtle sounds that carried across the empty spaces between buildings, all of it told stories to those who knew how to listen. Today, every story was screaming the same message. Danger was closing in from all sides. Maria was part of Alpha Team, a 6-person specialized reconnaissance unit attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment. Their official designation was Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. But everyone knew they were the tip of the spear, the eyes and ears that went where satellites couldn't see and drones couldn't reach. For the past 3 weeks, they had been tracking Abu Nazir al-Khosti, a Taliban commander who had been responsible for coordinating attacks against NATO supply convoys throughout the region. The intelligence picture had finally come together 2 days ago. Al-Khosti was planning something big, something that required face-to-face coordination with cell leaders from across 3 provinces. The meeting was supposed to happen in this village, abandoned since coalition forces had cleared it 6 months earlier. Maria's team had been tasked with confirming the meeting, identifying the participants, and calling in a precision strike that would decapitate the Taliban leadership in this sector. It was supposed to be a career-making mission, the kind of successful operation that got you promoted and earned you a ticket back to the States with a chest full of medals. Instead, it was beginning to feel like the kind of mission that got you a flag-draped coffin and a letter home to family. She pressed her radio earpiece again, trying for the 15th time to reach their command center at Forward Operating Base Chapman. The static that filled her ears was different from normal radio interference. It had the artificial quality of deliberate jamming. Maria had heard that sound before, during her first deployment, when insurgents had used crude but effective jamming equipment to disrupt coalition communications before major attacks. The communication blackout had started exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes ago, right at the moment they were supposed to receive final confirmation of their extraction plan. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had known exactly when to cut their communications, which meant someone had detailed knowledge of their operational timeline. Maria's 5-man team was now scattered across the village according to a standard reconnaissance pattern that suddenly felt like a death trap. Each soldier had taken a defensive position that provided good fields of fire and multiple escape routes. But if the enemy knew their doctrine, those positions could just as easily become killing zones. The irony wasn't lost on her. Maria Esperanza Gonzalez had grown up in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles, where survival often meant knowing which streets to avoid and which corners belonged to which gangs. Her father, Roberto, had spent 40 years as a mechanic, his hands permanently stained with engine grease, and his back bent from decades of crawling under cars. Her mother, Carmen, worked double shifts as a registered nurse at County General Hospital, patching up the casualties of urban violence and poverty. Maria had joined the army 3 days after her 19th birthday, not out of patriotic fervor or family military tradition, but because she was tired of watching her neighborhood swallow up everyone she had grown up with. Her high school graduating class of 347 students had produced 2 college graduates, 15 gang members, and 43 teenage mothers. The rest had simply vanished into the gray economy of minimum wage jobs and fading dreams. The military had offered her something her neighborhood never could, the chance to be excellent at something that mattered. Basic training at Fort Benning had been tough, but not as tough as growing up in a place where gunshots were background music and sirens were lullabies. Advanced infantry training had introduced her to weapons, tactics, and leadership skills. But more importantly, it had taught her that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever expected from a 5'4" Latina from the wrong side of town. Her first deployment to Iraq had been an education in the realities of modern warfare. She had learned to read the micro-expressions on faces in crowded markets, to spot the telltale signs of improvised explosive devices, and to trust the instincts that kept soldiers alive in places where death could come from any direction at any moment. Her second deployment had refined those skills and added new ones: advanced marksmanship, small unit tactics, and the kind of situational awareness that turned good soldiers into exceptional ones. This third deployment to Afghanistan was supposed to be her victory lap, a chance to use everything she had learned to make a real difference in the war. She had volunteered for the reconnaissance unit because it offered the highest level of responsibility and the greatest opportunity to impact operations. Intelligence gathered by teams like hers had disrupted dozens of Taliban operations and saved hundreds of coalition lives. But sitting in this abandoned village with communications down and enemy forces closing in, all that training felt inadequate against the growing certainty that they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The Taliban forces operating in this region had become increasingly sophisticated over the past year, using tactics and equipment that suggested training by foreign military advisors. Recent intelligence reports had mentioned the presence of former Pakistani military officers and Chechen fighters who brought advanced tactical knowledge to what had once been a largely amateur insurgency. The village of Khost itself told a story of the cyclical nature of conflict in Afghanistan. Built around a natural spring that had sustained life in this harsh landscape for generations, it had been home to nearly 300 people before the war escalated in this region. The houses were built in the traditional Afghan style, with thick mud brick walls and flat roofs designed to withstand both summer heat and winter snow. Narrow alleys connected small courtyards where families had lived according to rhythms established over centuries. When Taliban forces had taken control of the village 8 months ago, they had used it as a staging area for attacks against coalition supply routes. Coalition forces had eventually cleared the village in an operation that had taken 3 days and cost the lives of 2 American soldiers and an unknown number of civilians. The Taliban had melted away into the mountains, taking their weapons and their wounded with them, leaving behind only empty buildings and the bitter knowledge that they would return as soon as coalition forces moved on to other objectives. Intelligence suggested that the Taliban had indeed returned, using the village as a meeting place for high-level coordination, because its remote location and familiarity with the terrain gave them multiple advantages. What Maria's team hadn't considered was the possibility that their own mission had been compromised from the beginning. Her team leader, Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez, had positioned himself in a 2-story house approximately 200 meters to her east. Rodriguez was a veteran of 4 deployments who had earned his stripes the hard way, through a combination of tactical excellence and the kind of leadership that kept soldiers alive in impossible situations. Born in San Antonio to a family with 3 generations of military service, Rodriguez understood both the weight of tradition and the evolving nature of modern warfare. Through her scope, Maria could see Rodriguez's silhouette moving with practiced caution from window to window, maintaining visual contact with the scattered members of his team while continuously scanning for threats. His movements had the fluid economy of a soldier who had learned to waste neither time nor energy in combat situations. Rodriguez had a reputation for reading tactical situations with almost supernatural accuracy, which made his obvious anxiety about their current position all the more troubling. To her south, positioned near what had once been the village well, Corporal Jake Matthews was bent over his radio equipment with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve a life-or-death puzzle. Matthews was the team's communications specialist, a role that had become increasingly complex as insurgents had developed more sophisticated methods of electronic warfare. A former college student from rural Montana who had enlisted after the 2001 attacks, Matthews possessed both the technical expertise to operate cutting-edge communication equipment and the practical wisdom to know when technology was failing him. The frustrated hand signals Matthews was sending in Rodriguez's direction told Maria everything she needed to know about their communication situation. This wasn't a technical malfunction or atmospheric interference. Someone was deliberately jamming their frequencies with equipment sophisticated enough to target specific military bands while leaving commercial frequencies untouched. The implications were chilling. Whoever was jamming their communications had access to detailed technical specifications of American military radio equipment. Private First Class David Kim had taken position on the 2nd floor of a house at the village's northern perimeter, his M14 enhanced battle rifle providing the team's designated marksman capability. At 22 years old, Kim was the youngest member of the team, but his steady nerves and exceptional marksmanship had already saved their lives on multiple occasions during this deployment. A second-generation Korean American from Los Angeles, Kim had grown up shooting competitively before enlisting, and his natural talent had been refined by months of additional training at the Army Marksmanship Unit. Through her binoculars, Maria could see the distinctive profile of Kim's rifle tracking slowly across the horizon as he methodically scanned potential approach routes. Kim's youth was balanced by an almost obsessive attention to detail and a shooting ability that bordered on the supernatural. If enemy forces were moving in the distance, Kim would spot them first, and if they came within range, his rifle would ensure they didn't get much closer. The fifth member of their team, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, had positioned himself near the village entrance, covering the most obvious avenue of approach for hostile forces. Johnson was the team's explosives expert and close-quarters combat specialist, a 6'2" former high school football player from Detroit who had joined the Army after a college sports injury ended his dreams of playing professionally. Johnson's size was intimidating, but his real value came from his comprehensive understanding of explosives and his tactical intelligence in urban combat situations. He could construct improvised explosive devices from household materials, defuse sophisticated bombs planted by insurgents, and clear buildings with the kind of methodical efficiency that kept friendly casualties to a minimum. In their current tactical situation, Johnson's position near the village entrance made sense from a defensive standpoint, but Maria was beginning to realize that conventional defensive tactics might not be sufficient for what they were facing. The morning heat was already building, turning their body armor into personal ovens and making concentration more difficult with each passing minute. Afghanistan in summer was an exercise in endurance, where dehydration could kill you almost as quickly as enemy fire. Maria took a careful sip from her water bottle, knowing that conservation would become critical if they were trapped in the village for an extended period. She checked her watch again. 3 hours and 27 minutes since their last communication with base. In military terms, that was an eternity. Standard protocol called for communication checks every 30 minutes during reconnaissance missions, and the failure to establish contact should have triggered automatic search and rescue procedures. The fact that no relief forces had appeared suggested either that their base was under attack, that the communication blackout was more extensive than they realized, or that someone had convinced their commanders that Alpha Team was operating under an extended communication silence. None of those possibilities offered much comfort. The first concrete sign of immediate danger came from Kim's position. Through her scope, Maria saw him suddenly drop low behind his cover and begin signaling frantically toward Rodriguez's position, using the hand signals that every soldier learned but hoped never to use in combat. Enemy movement, northeast sector, multiple contacts, estimated strength 15+. Maria's pulse quickened as she shifted her position to get a visual on the area Kim was indicating. The elevated terrain to the northeast had been part of their contingency planning. It offered excellent fields of fire toward the village and multiple covered approaches for attacking forces. If enemy forces were moving into position there, it meant the trap was about to spring. Through her scope, she could see them clearly now. At least 15 Taliban fighters, moving with the kind of tactical coordination that spoke of military training, rather than the enthusiasm of amateur insurgents. They were well-armed, well-organized, and moving in a pattern that suggested detailed knowledge of American small unit tactics. These weren't local farmers pressed into service, or young men motivated by religious fervor. These were professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. Maria keyed her radio, hoping that short-range team frequencies were still operational, despite the broader communication jamming. Dragon 6. This is Dragon 2. We have multiple hostile contacts moving in from the northeast. Count at least 15, possibly more. These guys look professional. Rodriguez's response came back immediately, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a leader processing bad news while maintaining command authority. Copy that. 2. I see them. They're not just moving to attack positions, they're moving to specific positions that will cut off our escape routes. This is a deliberate ambush with detailed intelligence support. The reality of their tactical situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. The communication blackout, the precise timing of enemy movement, the sophisticated jamming equipment, the coordinated positioning. This wasn't a chance encounter with insurgent forces. Someone had fed detailed information about their mission to the Taliban, including their planned insertion point, their tactical doctrine, and quite possibly their extraction timeline. Maria's mind raced through the implications. If their mission had been compromised from the beginning, then everything they thought they knew about the tactical situation was suspect. The village might be completely surrounded rather than simply observed. The enemy forces they could see might represent only a fraction of the total hostile strength in the area. Most importantly, the Taliban forces might be prepared for exactly the kind of response that American doctrine would dictate in this situation. She continued scanning the terrain beyond the village, looking for additional threats that Kim's elevated position might not be able to observe. What she saw made her stomach drop. Movement to the west, partially concealed by a ridgeline that ran parallel to the village. More fighters, these carrying what looked like heavy weapons. She counted at least 6 more contacts, including one who appeared to be setting up a heavy machine gun position. Dragon 6. I've got additional contacts to the west. At least 6 more, including heavy weapons. They're establishing supporting fire positions. Rodriguez's response carried a grim acknowledgement of their deteriorating situation. All units, be advised we have multiple enemy forces moving to surround our position. This is a coordinated attack with superior numbers and heavy weapons support. Prepare for immediate contact. Maria checked her equipment one more time, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature over 3 deployments. M4 carbine with 4 30-round magazines plus 1 loaded in the weapon. Beretta M9 pistol with 3 15-round magazines. 2 M67 fragmentation grenades. Fixed blade combat knife. Standard combat load for a reconnaissance mission, but woefully inadequate for the kind of prolonged engagement that was beginning to look inevitable. The Taliban fighters had stopped their visible advance and were now taking covered positions approximately 400 meters from the village perimeter. Through her scope, Maria could see them unpacking equipment with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who had rehearsed this operation multiple times. The heavy machine gun position was nearly complete, and what she had initially thought might be mortar equipment was revealing itself to be something far more dangerous: rocket-propelled grenades and possibly recoilless rifles. These weapons represented a quantum leap in capability beyond the small arms and improvised explosives that characterized most Taliban attacks. Someone had equipped this unit with military-grade heavy weapons and trained them in coordinated assault tactics. The level of sophistication suggested support from a national intelligence service or a very well-funded terrorist organization. Through her earpiece, Johnson's voice cut through the tactical frequency with the calm professionalism that made him invaluable in crisis situations. Dragon 6. I've got movement to the south as well. 6 additional contacts moving to establish blocking positions on our primary escape route. They're carrying what looks like anti-tank weapons. The trap was now clearly visible in all its dimensions. Taliban forces were moving to surround the village from at least 3 directions, establishing heavy weapons positions that would make any attempt to break contact extremely costly. They weren't planning a quick assault that might allow some members of the team to escape. They were preparing for a methodical destruction of Alpha Team that would serve as both a tactical victory and a propaganda triumph. Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, but underneath it was a cold, analytical process that had kept her alive through dozens of firefights. The enemy had numerical superiority, better positioning, heavier weapons, and the advantage of having planned this engagement in advance. In a conventional defensive battle, her team would be overwhelmed within the first few minutes of contact. But Maria had learned something during her years in the military that went beyond the tactics they taught in training manuals. She had learned to think like her enemies, to anticipate their plans, and to find opportunities in situations that appeared hopeless. If Alpha Team was going to survive this engagement, it wouldn't be through textbook defensive tactics. She began to study the village layout with new eyes, looking not for defensive positions but for tactical advantages that the enemy might not have anticipated. The narrow alleys between houses could channel attacking forces into predictable kill zones if someone was positioned correctly. The old stone well in the center of the village could provide hard cover while offering rapid access to multiple escape routes. The flat rooftops could be used for movement and flanking maneuvers if someone was willing to accept the risk of exposure. Most importantly, Maria realized that the Taliban forces were positioned to fight against a conventional American response, a defensive perimeter, calls for air support, and attempts to hold position until reinforcements arrived. They weren't prepared for an unconventional response that abandoned defensive doctrine in favor of aggressive, unpredictable tactics. The first mortar round impacted against the house where Kim had taken position, sending a shower of debris across the village square and announcing the beginning of what would either be their last battle or their most decisive victory. Through her scope, Maria could see Kim stumbling from his damaged position, blood streaming from a head wound, but still carrying his rifle and moving with the determined swagger of a soldier who refused to quit. The battle for their lives had officially begun, but Maria was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Instead of hunkering down and waiting for the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement, she was going to take the initiative and create the kind of tactical chaos that turned planned operations into desperate improvisations. As explosions began to rock the village with increasing frequency, Maria made the decision that would define everything that followed. She was going to abandon her position, move directly toward the enemy forces, and create the conditions for what would either be a brilliant tactical victory or a suicidal gesture of defiance. The stage was set for 83 seconds that would test everything she had learned about combat, survival, and the will to live when death seemed certain. But those 83 seconds were still ahead of her. First, she had to survive the preliminary engagement that would strip her of her primary weapon and force her to rely on nothing but training, intelligence, and the kind of desperate courage that emerges when survival becomes the only option that matters. The village of Khost had been abandoned for months, its residents having fled when fighting in the region intensified. The empty houses and silent streets created a maze of potential hiding spots and ambush points. Intel suggested that Taliban forces had been using the village as a staging area, but the reconnaissance was supposed to be routine. Get in, observe, gather data, get out. Simple. Nothing about this mission had been simple. Maria's team leader, Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez, had positioned himself in a house about 200 meters to her east. Through her scope, she could see his silhouette moving cautiously from window to window, trying to maintain visual contact with the rest of the team while scanning for threats. Rodriguez was a veteran of 4 deployments, a man who had seen enough combat to know when something felt off. To her south, Corporal Jake Matthews had taken position near what used to be the village well. Matthews was the team's communications specialist, and the fact that he couldn't re-establish contact with their base was becoming increasingly troubling. His frustrated hand signals told Maria that the communication blackout wasn't technical, someone was jamming their frequencies. Private First Class David Kim, their designated marksman, had climbed to the 2nd floor of a house on the village's northern edge. Through her binoculars, Maria could see the barrel of his rifle tracking slowly across the horizon. Kim was young but steady, with an eye for detail that had saved their lives more than once. If there were enemy forces moving in the distance, he would spot them first. The 5th member of their team, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, was their explosives expert and close-quarters combat specialist. Johnson had positioned himself near the village entrance, the most likely avenue of approach for any hostile forces. At 6 feet 2 inches and built like a linebacker, Johnson was intimidating in close combat, but he was also smart enough to know that muscle meant nothing against a well-planned ambush. Maria checked her watch. They had been in position for 3 hours, and still no word from command. The original plan had them extracted by noon, but it was now past 2 in the afternoon. In her gut, she knew they were on their own. The first sign of trouble came from Kim's position. Through her scope, Maria saw him suddenly drop low and signal frantically toward Rodriguez's position. Enemy movement, northeast, multiple contacts. Maria's pulse quickened as she adjusted her position to get a better view of the area Kim was indicating. Through her scope, she could see them at least 15 Taliban fighters moving with practiced precision through the rocky terrain beyond the village. They were well armed and moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested military training. This wasn't a ragtag group of insurgents. These men knew what they were doing. Maria keyed her radio, hoping the short-range team frequency was still clear. Dragon 6. This is Dragon 2. We have multiple hostile contacts moving in from the northeast. Count at least 15. Possibly more. Rodriguez's voice crackled back immediately. Copy that. 2. I see them. They're trying to flank us from 3 sides. This is a coordinated attack. The reality of their situation became crystal clear. The communication blackout, the precise timing of the enemy movement, the careful positioning. This wasn't a chance encounter. Someone had fed information about their mission to the Taliban. They were the targets, not the observers. Maria's mind raced through their options. They could try to fight their way out, but 15 against 5 were terrible odds, especially if more enemy forces were moving in from other directions. They could try to hide and wait for extraction, but with compromised communications, help might not be coming at all. They could attempt to break contact and escape on foot, but the terrain beyond the village offered little cover, and they would be easy targets in the open desert. As she weighed their options, Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. The Taliban fighters weren't just moving to attack positions, they were moving to specific positions. Positions that would cut off every escape route from the village. Someone had given them detailed information about standard American tactical doctrine, about how a small reconnaissance team would position itself in terrain like this. Dragon 6, they know our positions, Maria reported. This is a deliberate ambush. Someone gave them our playbook. Rodriguez's response was grim. Roger that. All units, prepare for contact. We're going to have to fight our way out of this one. Maria checked her equipment one more time. She had her M4 carbine with 4 magazines of ammunition, her sidearm with 3 magazines, 2 fragmentation grenades, and her combat knife. Standard load for a reconnaissance mission, but not nearly enough for a prolonged firefight against superior numbers. The Taliban fighters had stopped their advance and taken cover about 400 meters from the village perimeter. Maria could see them setting up what looked like a heavy machine gun position. Others were unpacking equipment that might be mortars or rocket-propelled grenades. They weren't planning a quick assault, they were preparing for a siege. Through her earpiece, Maria heard Johnson's voice, tense but controlled. Dragon 6, I've got movement to the south as well. At least 6 more contacts moving to flank our position. The trap was closing from multiple directions. Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat. But underneath it was a cold calculation. The Taliban had numerical superiority, better positioning, and heavier weapons. In a straight fight, her team would be overwhelmed within minutes. But Maria had learned something during her years in the military that went beyond standard tactics and weapons training. She had learned to think like her enemies, to anticipate their moves, and to find opportunities in the midst of chaos. If they were going to survive this, it wouldn't be through conventional tactics. She began to study the village layout with new eyes, looking not for defensive positions but for advantages that the enemy might not expect. The narrow alleys between houses could channel attacking forces into predictable patterns. The old well in the center of the village could provide cover while offering multiple escape routes. The flat rooftops could be used for rapid movement if someone was willing to take the risk. Most importantly, Maria realized that the Taliban fighters were positioned to fight a conventional defensive battle. They expected the Americans to try to hold their positions and call for air support or reinforcement. They weren't prepared for an aggressive, unconventional response. Maria keyed her radio again. Dragon 6, I have an idea, but it's going to require us to do something they won't expect. What do you have in mind, too? We don't fight them where they expect us to fight. We take the initiative and hit them where they're not prepared. Before Rodriguez could respond, the first mortar round exploded against the house where Kim had taken position. The blast sent debris flying across the village square, and Maria could see Kim stumbling from his position, blood streaming down his face. The battle for their lives had begun, and Maria knew that the next few hours would determine whether any of them would make it home. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes. As more explosions rocked the village, Maria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hunkering down and waiting for the enemy to come to them, she was going to take the fight directly to the Taliban forces. It was risky, unconventional, and probably crazy. It was also their only chance of survival. The stage was set for 83 seconds that would test everything Maria had learned about combat, survival, and the will to live. But those 83 seconds were still to come. First, she had to position herself for what would either be a brilliant tactical victory or a suicidal last stand. As Maria prepared to move from her position, she couldn't know that within the next hour, a series of events would unfold that would strip her of her primary weapon and force her to rely on nothing but her training, her intelligence, and her refusal to give up. The 83 seconds that would define her were approaching, but the path to that moment was still to be written in gunfire, explosions, and the kind of desperate courage that emerges only when survival is the only option left. The explosion that shattered Kim's position marked the beginning of the most intense 20 minutes of combat Maria had ever experienced. The Taliban forces had opened their attack with a coordinated barrage of mortar rounds and rocket-propelled grenades that turned the quiet village into a hellscape of flying debris and collapsing walls. The sophistication of their fire coordination spoke to months of planning and rehearsal. Maria pressed herself against the stone wall as chunks of ancient masonry rained down around her position. The enemy had clearly studied American small unit tactics and knew exactly how to disrupt a defensive perimeter. Their initial barrage was designed not to kill immediately, but to force the team members out of their prepared positions and into the open, where they could be targeted by the heavy weapons teams that were now revealing themselves on the surrounding ridgelines. Through the chaos of explosions and dust clouds, Maria could hear Rodriguez trying to coordinate their response over the team frequency. His voice remained steady despite the circumstances, issuing movement orders and fire commands that demonstrated why he had earned his leadership position through 4 combat deployments. But even Rodriguez's exceptional tactical skills couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of their situation. They were outnumbered at least 4-1 by an enemy that had planned this engagement in advance. "All units, we need to break contact immediately," Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece. "They're trying to pin us down for a deliberate attack." "Dragon 4, what's your status?" Kim's response came back, strained but determined. "Still mobile, but my position is compromised. I can see at least 3 machine gun teams setting up on the eastern ridge. We've got about 2 minutes before they establish interlocking fields of fire." Maria knew what that meant. Once the Taliban forces completed their heavy weapons deployment, the village would become a killing zone with no escape routes. Standard doctrine called for immediate withdrawal under covering fire, but the enemy had clearly anticipated that response and positioned themselves to cut off every obvious escape route. Johnson's voice cut through the tactical frequency with urgent information that confirmed Maria's worst fears. "Dragon 6. The southern approach is completely blocked. I count 8 hostiles with automatic weapons and what looks like a recoilless rifle. They're not just trying to kill us, they want to capture someone alive." The implications hit Maria like a physical blow. A live American prisoner would be worth more than a dozen dead soldiers to the Taliban propaganda machine. The sophistication of this ambush, the careful positioning to prevent escape rather than simply maximize casualties, the presence of capture equipment. This was a deliberate kidnapping operation disguised as a tactical engagement. That realization changed everything about their tactical situation. If the enemy's primary objective was capture rather than elimination, they would focus their fire to disable rather than kill. At least initially. That might provide Alpha Team with opportunities that wouldn't exist in a conventional firefight, but it also meant that surrender was not an option. Everyone knew what happened to American soldiers who fell into Taliban hands. Maria made her decision in the span of 2 heartbeats. Instead of falling back toward the team rally point as doctrine dictated, she was going to move forward toward the enemy positions and attempt to disrupt their coordination before they could complete their deployment. It was tactically unsound, probably suicidal, and completely contrary to everything she had been taught about small unit operations. It was also the only thing they hadn't planned for. "Dragon 6, this is Dragon 2, Maria transmitted as she prepared to leave her position. "I'm going to try to disrupt their eastern deployment. Give me covering fire, and be ready to move when I create an opening." Rodriguez's response was immediate and predictable. "Negative, Dragon 2. Maintain your position and prepare for coordinated withdrawal." But Maria was already moving, using the smoke and dust from the ongoing bombardment as concealment for an approach that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Her route took her through a series of narrow alleys that offered cover from direct observation while allowing rapid movement toward the enemy positions. The Taliban forces had established their eastern heavy weapons position on a ridge approximately 300 meters from the village, a location that provided excellent fields of fire while being protected by natural cover. Maria could see the machine gun crew setting up their weapon, while two additional fighters established security positions to protect the gun team from exactly the kind of flanking attack she was attempting. Her approach would have to be perfect. She had one chance to get close enough to disrupt their position before they spotted her, and failure would leave her isolated from her team with no possibility of support. As she moved through the maze of village alleys, Maria's mind automatically calculated distances, angles, and timing with the precision that separated exceptional soldiers from those who simply followed orders. The sound of sustained automatic weapons fire erupted from the direction of Johnson's position, indicating that the Southern blocking force had initiated contact. Through her earpiece, she could hear the controlled but urgent exchanges of a team under heavy fire, but still maintaining tactical discipline. Johnson was directing Kim and Matthews in a fighting withdrawal toward the village center, but Maria could tell from the intensity of enemy fire that they were running out of time and options. She reached the eastern edge of the village just as the Taliban machine gun crew completed their setup. Through a gap in a stone wall, Maria could see the weapon, a Soviet-era PKM machine gun that could put out 750 rounds per minute and effectively dominate any terrain within 1,000 meters. The crew consisted of a gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer, while the two security positions held riflemen with AK-47 seconds and what looked like at least one rocket-propelled grenade. Maria had 2 fragmentation grenades, which would be sufficient to neutralize the machine gun position if she could get within throwing range without being detected. The challenge was covering the final 50 meters of open ground between the village edge and the ridge where the enemy had positioned themselves. She studied the terrain with the intensity of someone whose life depended on reading every rock and depression correctly. A dry creek bed ran from the village toward the ridge, offering concealment for most of the approach, but requiring her to expose herself for the final 20 meters. It was doable, but only if she moved while the enemy was distracted by the main engagement. The opportunity came when Johnson's team initiated a concentrated burst of fire toward the southern positions. The machine gun crew's attention shifted toward the sound of combat, and Maria sprinted from cover toward the creek bed with the fluid speed of someone who had learned to move under fire during 3 combat deployments. She covered the first 30 meters without detection, sliding into the creek bed just as one of the security positions began to scan in her direction. The dried watercourse was deeper than she had expected, providing excellent concealment but requiring her to crawl rather than run for the remainder of her approach. As Maria moved through the creek bed, she could hear the radio chatter from her team becoming increasingly desperate. They were running low on ammunition. Kim had taken additional wounds, and the Taliban forces were beginning to close the ring around the village center. She had perhaps 3 minutes before the tactical situation became irretrievable. She reached the base of the ridge and began her final approach to the machine gun position. The climb was steep and exposed, requiring her to move from rock to rock while staying below the skyline that would silhouette her against the morning sun. The physical exertion was demanding, but Maria's conditioning allowed her to maintain both speed and silence as she closed the final distance. At 15 meters from the machine gun position, she could hear the crew talking in Pashto while they adjusted their weapons' elevation for maximum effect against her team's positions. She understood enough of the language to know they were coordinating with other positions for a final assault that would begin within minutes. Maria pulled the pins on both fragmentation grenades simultaneously, cooking them for exactly 3 seconds before throwing them in a coordinated pattern that would catch the entire crew in the blast radius. The explosions were devastating at close range, eliminating the machine gun threat and creating exactly the kind of tactical disruption she had hoped to achieve. But her success came with an immediate and devastating cost. The explosions had revealed her position to every enemy fighter within a mile, and she could hear shouts and movement as Taliban forces began converging on her location. Moreover, her route back to the village was now cut off by enemy forces who had repositioned to intercept any retreat. She was alone, cut off from her team, and surrounded by hostile forces who now knew exactly where she was. Worse, the elimination of the machine gun position had only temporarily disrupted the enemy plan. Within minutes, they would reorganize and complete their encirclement of the village, trapping her team with or without her contribution. Maria made the hardest decision of her military career. Instead of attempting to return to her team, she was going to continue moving toward the enemy command position and try to create enough chaos to allow Alpha Team to break contact and escape. It meant sacrificing herself for the possibility that her teammates might survive, but it also offered the only realistic chance that anyone would make it out of this trap alive. Her movement toward the enemy command position required crossing 200 meters of open ground, while under direct observation from multiple hostile positions. It was impossible to do silently, so Maria chose speed over stealth, sprinting from cover to cover, while automatic weapons fire began tracking her movement across the rocky terrain. She reached a cluster of boulders that offered temporary protection while she assessed her next move. The enemy command position was visible. Now a group of 6 fighters gathered around what appeared to be a radio operator, positioned on a small plateau that provided observation over the entire tactical area. Taking out that position would disrupt enemy coordination and possibly allow her team to escape, but reaching it would require crossing a final stretch of completely open ground under fire from multiple directions. The decision was made for her when a burst of AK-47 fire sparked off the rocks inches from her head. The Taliban fighters had triangulated her position and were closing in from 3 directions. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they could coordinate their fire effectively enough to pin her down permanently. Maria sprinted toward the command position with the desperate speed of someone who had run out of alternatives. Bullets snapped past her with the distinctive crack of supersonic projectiles, but none found their mark as she covered the distance with a combination of athletic ability and tactical movement that kept her just ahead of the aimed fire. She reached the base of the plateau just as the first Taliban fighter appeared at the edge of her boulder shelter, confirming that her previous position was now overrun. The climb to the command position was steep and completely exposed, but it was also the last thing the enemy would expect from a single soldier who should have been focused on escape rather than attack. Maria reached the top of the plateau to find herself face to face with 6 Taliban fighters who were so focused on coordinating the attack on her team that they had failed to post adequate security on their own position. She had achieved complete tactical surprise, but she was also completely outnumbered and cut off from any possibility of support. The engagement that followed lasted exactly 17 seconds. Maria's M4 carbine cut down 3 of the fighters before the weapon jammed on a defective round, leaving her with her sidearm and combat knife against 3 remaining enemies, who were now fully aware of her presence and reacting with the trained responses of professional soldiers. Her pistol eliminated 1 more enemy before being knocked from her hand by the stock of an AK-47 wielded by a fighter who had circled behind her position. The impact sent shooting pains up her arm and left her weaponless except for her combat knife, facing 2 Taliban fighters who were now maneuvering to capture rather than kill her. It was at this moment, disarmed and surrounded, that Maria's training transcended everything she had learned from manuals and instructors. The next 83 seconds would determine whether she lived or died, whether her team escaped or perished, and whether her sacrifice would have any meaning beyond a brief entry in a classified after-action report. As the 2 remaining Taliban fighters moved to flank her position, Maria's mind shifted into the hyper-aware state that exceptional soldiers access in moments of ultimate crisis. Time seemed to slow, details became crystalline, and possibilities that had been invisible suddenly revealed themselves with perfect clarity. The 83 seconds that would define her entire military career were about to begin, and Maria Gonzalez was ready to discover exactly what she was capable of when everything else had been stripped away, except the will to survive and the refusal to surrender. Time compressed into a crystalline focus as Maria faced the 2 Taliban fighters who had flanked her position on the plateau. Her M4 carbine lay useless 3 meters away, its action jammed on a defective round at the worst possible moment. Her sidearm had been knocked from her grip and was somewhere among the rocks behind her, equally useless in the immediate tactical situation. She was left with her combat knife and whatever advantages she could create from superior training and the kind of desperate innovation that emerged when survival became the only option. The 2 fighters approaching her were not the amateur insurgents that populated Taliban propaganda videos. These men moved with the controlled precision of soldiers who had been trained by professionals. Their AK-47 seconds held in proper tactical positions as they maneuvered to capture rather than kill her. Their coordination spoke to extensive practice in exactly this kind of close-quarters situation. But Maria had advantages they couldn't see. Her 3 deployments had included extensive training in close-quarters combat, knife fighting, and the kind of hand-to-hand techniques that turned smaller soldiers into effective fighters against larger opponents. More importantly, she had grown up in neighborhoods where physical confrontation was a regular part of life, and she had learned to fight with the vicious efficiency of someone who understood that losing meant more than just embarrassment. The first fighter made the mistake of approaching too directly, confident that his rifle gave him overwhelming advantage against an opponent armed only with a knife. Maria waited until he was within arm's reach, then exploded into motion with the fluid violence that characterized her combat style. Her initial move was a textbook disarmament technique, striking upward against the fighter's rifle while simultaneously driving her knee into his solar plexus. The impact doubled him over and loosened his grip on the weapon, allowing her to strip it away and reverse it in a single flowing motion. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and left her armed with an AK-47, while the first fighter stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The second fighter reacted immediately, raising his own weapon and beginning to squeeze the trigger that would have ended the engagement in his favor. But Maria had anticipated his response and was already moving, using the disabled first fighter as cover while she brought the captured AK-47 to bear. Her first burst caught the second fighter center mass, dropping him before he could complete his aimed fire. But her tactical situation had just become infinitely more complex. The sound of automatic weapons fire from her position had attracted the attention of every Taliban fighter in the immediate area, and she could already hear shouts and movement as additional enemies converged on the plateau. Her temporary victory had bought her perhaps 15 seconds before she would be facing odds that even exceptional training couldn't overcome. That was when she heard the voices approaching from the trail that led up the backside of the plateau, 3 more fighters moving rapidly toward her position with the urgency of soldiers responding to a tactical emergency. In her hyper-aware state, Maria could distinguish their individual voices and estimate their positions based on the sound of their movement through the rocky terrain. She had approximately 10 seconds before they reached the plateau, and her position offered no cover that would protect her from automatic weapons fired by multiple attackers. Standard tactics would call for immediate withdrawal, but withdrawal would mean abandoning her elevated position and losing the tactical advantage it provided for observing and disrupting the larger battle still raging around the village below. Maria made a decision that violated every principle of sound tactics. Instead of retreating, she would advance to meet the approaching fighters on terrain of her choosing. It was aggressive to the point of being suicidal, but it was also the last thing they would expect from a single soldier who should have been focused on escape. She moved down the trail toward the approaching voices, using the rocky terrain to mask her movement, while positioning herself for an ambush that would allow her to engage each enemy individually, rather than face all 3 simultaneously. The trail was narrow and winding, with several points where the natural terrain would channel the approaching fighters into positions where they couldn't support each other effectively. Maria reached her chosen ambush site, a sharp turn in the trail where large boulders created a natural choke point just as the first of the 3 fighters came into view. He was moving rapidly but carelessly, his attention focused on reaching the plateau, rather than scanning for immediate threats along the trail. Her first burst from the captured AK-47 dropped him before he could react. But the sound of gunfire immediately alerted his companions to the presence of an enemy on the trail below them. Maria could hear them shouting warnings to each other in Pashto while they maneuvered to flank her position from above. The second fighter appeared at the edge of the boulder field, trying to use the rocks for cover while maintaining a field of fire toward her position. But Maria had anticipated this movement and was already repositioning to a flanking position that negated his cover. Her second burst caught him as he attempted to bound from one rock to another, eliminating him before he could establish an effective firing position. The third fighter had learned from his companion's mistakes and was attempting a more sophisticated approach, using fire and movement to keep Maria pinned down, while he maneuvered to a position where he could bring effective fire to bear. But his tactics were conventional, and Maria had long since abandoned conventional responses to this unconventional situation. Instead of remaining in a defensive position, she advanced directly toward his last known location, with the kind of aggressive movement that turned hunted into hunter. The terrain favored this approach, allowing her to use natural cover to close distance while maintaining the initiative that had kept her alive through the previous engagements. She found him positioned behind a large rock formation, exactly where tactical doctrine would have placed him for maximum effectiveness against a conventionally defending enemy. But Maria's approach from an unexpected angle gave her a clear field of fire before he realized that his position had been compromised. Her final burst eliminated the last immediate threat to her position, but the victory came with the sobering realization that she had now engaged 7 enemy fighters in individual combat and survived only through a combination of exceptional training, tactical innovation, and the kind of luck that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. More importantly, the sound of sustained combat from her elevated position was drawing attention from across the entire tactical area. Through her captured AK-47 sights, she could see additional Taliban fighters breaking off from the main engagement around the village and beginning to move toward her location. But something else was happening that changed the entire dynamic of the battle. The disruption she had created by eliminating the command position and the heavy weapons team had broken the coordination of the Taliban attack on the village below. Instead of the methodical, coordinated assault that had been developing, the remaining enemy forces were now reacting to individual threats and losing the tactical initiative that had made their numerical superiority so dangerous. Through the natural amplification of the rocky terrain, Maria could hear Rodriguez's voice over the radio, coordinating a breakout attempt that took advantage of the chaos she had created. Alpha Team was moving toward the northern edge of the village, using the confusion among the Taliban forces to attempt an escape that would have been impossible just minutes earlier. But their escape would only be successful if the enemy forces converging on her position remained focused on her, rather than redeploying to intercept her team's withdrawal route. That meant she needed to continue creating the kind of tactical disruption that would hold their attention, regardless of the personal cost. Maria checked the ammunition remaining in her captured weapon, approximately half a magazine, enough for one more engagement but not enough for a prolonged firefight. She also retrieved her sidearm and combat knife, giving her backup options for the close-quarters fighting that seemed inevitable. The approaching Taliban forces were now close enough that she could hear individual voices and estimate their strength at approximately 12 fighters moving in 3 separate groups. They were converging on her position from different directions, using classic small unit tactics to prevent her from escaping while maintaining sufficient spacing to avoid being caught in a single engagement. Maria realized that her survival now depended on doing something so tactically unexpected that it would disrupt their coordination and create opportunities for individual engagements, rather than facing the entire force simultaneously. Looking at the terrain around her position, she identified a possibility that was both brilliant and completely insane. The plateau where she had eliminated the command position was connected to the main ridge by a narrow rock formation that dropped almost vertically for 30 meters before connecting to a talus slope that led down toward the village. In daylight, with proper equipment, it might be possible to descend that route safely. In combat conditions, with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions, it was essentially a controlled fall that might or might not end in survival. But it would also take her completely outside the area where the converging Taliban forces expected to find her, potentially allowing her to reach the northern edge of the village where she might be able to link up with her team's escape route. Maria made her decision with the same instantaneous calculation that had characterized every choice during the past 20 minutes of combat. She would descend the cliff face, using her combat equipment to control the descent, while moving fast enough to stay ahead of enemy fire. The descent began as a barely controlled rappel, using her rifle sling and equipment straps as improvised ropes. The rock face was steep and unstable, with loose stones that clattered down the slope and announced her movement to anyone within hearing distance. But it was also completely outside the area where the Taliban forces were positioned to intercept her. She had descended approximately 20 meters when the first enemy fighters reached the edge of the plateau above her. Their shouts of surprise and frustration confirmed that her route had taken them completely by surprise, but they quickly began directing fire down the cliff face in an attempt to stop her escape. Bullets sparked off the rock face around her as she continued her controlled fall down the remaining 10 meters of cliff. The talus slope below offered better footing, but no cover from the automatic weapons fire that was now being directed from the plateau above. Maria hit the talus slope at a dead run, using the loose rocks and steep angle to build speed while making herself a difficult target for the shooters above. The slope was treacherous and would have been dangerous under normal circumstances, but her combat conditioning allowed her to maintain balance while building the momentum she needed to reach cover at the bottom. She reached the base of the slope just as a sustained burst of automatic weapons fire chewed up the rocks where she had been seconds earlier. The Taliban fighters on the plateau were now repositioning to continue their pursuit, but their route would require them to circle around the ridge formation, giving her several minutes of lead time. More importantly, she could now see the northern edge of the village, where Rodriguez was leading Alpha Team toward their escape route. They were approximately 400 meters away and moving steadily, but they were also being pursued by Taliban forces that had broken off from the main engagement. Maria realized that she was now in a position to provide covering fire that could make the difference between her team's successful escape and their capture or elimination. Her captured AK-47 had limited ammunition remaining, but her elevated position gave her excellent fields of fire toward the pursuing Taliban forces. Her first carefully aimed shots disrupted the closest pursuit group, forcing them to take cover and allowing Alpha Team to open the distance between themselves and their pursuers. The engagement drew the attention of additional enemy forces, but it also confirmed to Rodriguez that at least one member of his team was still alive and fighting. As the echoes of gunfire faded across the rocky landscape, Maria counted the cost of the previous 83 seconds. She had eliminated 5 Taliban fighters in individual combat, disrupted a coordinated attack by superior forces, and created the tactical conditions that allowed her team to escape from what should have been an unsurvivable ambush. She was wounded, exhausted, and still surrounded by hostile forces in terrain that offered few advantages for continued survival. But she was alive, her team was escaping, and she had proven to herself and anyone who cared to calculate the odds that exceptional training and the refusal to surrender could overcome even overwhelming tactical disadvantages. The 83 seconds that had defined her military career were over, but Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez was still fighting, still moving, and still looking for the next opportunity to turn impossible odds into survivable challenges. The war was far from over, but she had won this battle through a combination of tactical skill, physical courage, and the kind of stubborn determination that separated those who talked about heroism from those who actually lived it under fire. In the years that would follow, military analysts would study the engagement as an example of how individual initiative could overcome numerical disadvantage and superior positioning. But for Maria, the real victory was simpler. When everything had been stripped away except her training and her will to live, she had discovered that those were enough to overcome any odds that mere numbers could create.